Okay, all right. So this is the subject today is arm's length transactions as a condition for a loan, where it's a little bit of a variation from your normal Ribbis situation. Normally, Ribbis means that the lender loans money to the borrower and asks for the money back plus a premium, some extra amount, which is going to be Ribbis. It could be that the borrower has to do a service for the lender in addition to paying back the loan, but something extra in addition to the loan. But the question is, what if there's something extra that is being requested by the lender that's part of the deal is something where it's an arm's length transaction and nobody is really losing out? It's a tit for tat type of transaction. The lender says to the borrower, I'm going to loan you $100, and the condition is that any time that you need some work done around the house, I'm a handyman, so you'll hire me, and I'm the one who will do the work, but they'll pay him the fair market price for whatever the work is going to be. So that's one version of the type of scenario that is discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. And another version is if you have a lender who extends the loan to the borrower, and the lender says, you'll pay me back money, and then you'll also lend me money, and then and I'll pay you back. So the borrower is going to give money, but the borrower is going to get the money back at the end. So both of these scenarios are discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. They're not explicitly really discussed in the Gemara at all. And the question is, so what should be the ruling in these types of cases? One of them, the first case appears at the end of Siman Kuf Samach, Sif Chav Gimel. Second case appears in Siman Kuf Samach, Sif Tes. And the first case is related to the question of Tovas Hana'ah. Why is it related to Tovas Hana'ah? Because a person, when they are making a decision about who to hire for a particular job, so they have the wherewithal to decide they're going to go to this professional, that professional, the other professional. The same way that a person who's giving trumos and maisos can decide whether they're going to give their trumos and maisos to a particular kohen, the maisos to a particular Levi, and so forth. So in a way, the machaber is taking away whatever is the value of that Tovas Hana'ah that the love, the borrower would be able to make the choice on his own whom he would choose to perform the transaction. What's the halacha? Let's take this first case. So the Shulchan Aruch in Sif Chav Gimel, the Machaber is very clear. Hamav emos almanashe kol malacha shetavu liyado yiteno salamalve lasosa aser. Machaber says that this is going to be prohibited. This is discussed in the Beis Yosef. In the Beis Yosef, it bases this issue upon a Rosh. The Rosh, which is source Gimel in the materials in Baba Metzia in Perek Ezu Neshach Siman Tes Zayin, speaks about the case of the Chassid Lo Kaima La'agra, where a Malva is not allowed to stipulate that as a result of his giving the loan, he'll be able to reside in a chutzir of the lova, in a courtyard of the lova that's not normally rented out, where there isn't going to be any neshech, shall we say, on the part of the lova, because the lova is not giving something for which he would otherwise get a value, since he doesn't normally rent it out. It could be that there'll be tarbis, says the Rosh, if the malva is a gabed David lemeger. But if he normally would pay rent to live in this space, truth is this is going to be us even if he wouldn't normally pay rent to live in this space. But nonetheless, says the Rosh, the fact that there is no loss to the love only means that there would be no obligation to return any kind of a ribbis, because there wasn't really ribbis that was received on a Torah level. But nonetheless, this is something which is still usher, and he compares it to the case of a kohen who loans money in order for the borrower to give the trumos to the kohen, which the lova needs to give to the kohen to a kohen anyway. And the Rosh says that in this case as well, since the lova needs to give the truma to the kohen to a kohen anyway, if it's stipulated he's going to give to this kohen, so it's not something that we would require that be disgorged once it would be given to the kohen. But the lashon of the Rosh, where he says that since it's a lo mafkinan mineh, If I assume that Tovas Hana'ah is Eina Mammon, Lo Mafkina Minei, of course he says it does depend on whether I say Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon. Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon, then the mere fact that the Love would be able to receive money from, let's say, somebody who wanted to pay the Love to give all of these, that the Love should agree to give all of his trumas to this person's son-in-law, who happens to be a Kohen, for example, or to his grandson who happens to be a Kohen. So if you hold it to that ability to stipulate a price for the right to choose who you're going to give your trumos to is go in the realm of mammon, so then it would be Ribbis Kitzutza Mamish. But even if I hold it Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mammon, that's the way that it's a paskin. The Ramah paskins in Siman Reish Gimel and Siman Chosh in Chosh Mishpat. He paskins Tovas Hana'ah is Eina Mammon because it's Eina Mammon, therefore it's not a Nikne B'Chalifin. And the Shach has a long dissertation at the end of Siman Shin Nun in Chosh Mishpat, in which the Shach demonstrates that we paskin clearly that Tovas Hana'ah is Eina Mammon. But says the Rosh, even if you assume that Tovas Hana'ah is Eina Mammon, nonetheless, all that means is Lo Mafkina Minei Miti, but the Lashon of Lo Mafkina Minei indicates that it's only Lo Mafkina Minei, but otherwise it is in fact Asr. The same way, it would be Asr for the borrower to turn to the lender and say, Haveni B'daba Chatzeri, go and loan me money and I'll let you live in my Chatzer, even if the Chatzer is a Chatzer de Lo Kaima La'agra. So this seems to be the source of the prohibition, at least as is understood by the Beis Yosef, based on his interpretation of the Rosh, and it's codified in the Shulchan Aruch. The Vilna Gaon gives another possible source for the Yisr. The Vilna Gaon quotes from a Yerushalmi and a Tosefta that says explicitly, not with respect to a loan transaction, but with respect to a sale transaction, that somebody who sells his field, he says, I'm going to sell my field to you, the seller says to the purchaser, on condition that I will continue to be able to work the field as a sharecropper and get a certain percentage of the yield of the field every single year as a sharecropper. So the Yerushalmi says it's mutter. The Yerushalmi doesn't talk about a loan transaction, but the Vilna Gaon says that what do I need to teach me that in a sale transaction this would be mutter? Why wouldn't it be mutter in a sale transaction? You could stipulate whatever you want when the seller and purchaser are bargaining a deal with each other. So he says, the Kamash Malan, that if it would be a milveh transaction, if it would be a loan transaction, so then it would be Yasser. So those are two possible sources for the Yisr. So the Ramah picks up on this, and the Ramah draws the distinction between if I would hold Tovas Hana'ah Mammon or Tovas Hana'ah Eina Mammon. And the Ramah says as follows. The Ramah says that L'manda Amr, if you do hold the Tovas Hana'ah, the right to be able to give your work to somebody else, the right for somebody to give his truma to somebody else, and that he can negotiate some money for it, that would therefore make it as if it is considered to have actual tangible monetary value. That's what we say, Tovas Hana'ah Have Mammon, so mikmei Ribbis Kitzutza. Then it would be considered to be Ribbis Kitzutza. Nafkamina, Mistama would be whatever the stringencies of Ribbis Daraisa would be applicable, including that you'd have to return whatever that benefit would be. Since there was originally a Tanai. And then the next sentence of the Ramah is subject to a little bit of debate. The next subject of the Ramah says, even if there would not be a Tanai, there would not have been a Tanai originally, but let's say that after the loan is extended by the Malva to the Lova now starts to give all of his work. He starts to give all of his business to the Malva. The Malva is a handyman. He's giving the Malva is a plumber. He gives all of his plumbing work, all of his, all of the work around the house that needs to be done, the fixing and the fixing up around the house, or the handyman work is now given over to the Malva, or he's Malva is a financial advisor, and he's now giving over all of his the money to be managed by the Malva, whatever the business is. The Malva owns a store, and now he used to frequent other stores, but he's now only frequenting the Malva store. So then the Ramah draws a distinction. He says, if the Love did not previously give his work or frequent the business of the Malva previously, so then it would be Asr, because then presumably it's only being done because of the loan. V'chein kol Tovas Hana'ah, and so too this would be true of any single Tovas Hana'ah, and so forth. So this is in the realm of a Tovas Hana'ah. But what if you have a situation where there was no Tanai, like the Ramah says, and the person was Eino Rogil, so the Lover was Eino Rogil to patronize the Mechaber's business beforehand. So then it seems like the Ramah is saying very clearly that it is Asr. But there is one possible more lenient interpretation of the Ramah, which is that the Ramah is started out by saying what? He started out by saying, well, if you hold that Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon, so then it's going to be like Ribbis Ketzutza, and that's going to be such a serious thing. So in the event, even if you didn't make a Tanai, since we're holding that if you would have made a Tanai, it would have been Ribbis D'Oraisa, because if Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon, so then you'd have to be Machmir in a case where the Lover was Eino Rogel beforehand, that even though there was no stipulation, even though this is an arm's length transaction, where the Malva is not really getting any kind of a benefit because the Malva is doing the work in order to earn whatever money he's being paid, or he's giving over goods in order to get whatever money he's being paid, and he's not selling at a premium, and he's not charging an extra amount for the work that he's doing. So maybe it's only us, according to the Ramah, if you are talking about if you're talking about the case where the assumption is that Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon, and that there was no Tanai, and there was Eino Rogil. But if you work with the premise that Tovas Hana'ah is Eino Mammon, the way that we paskin, the way that the Ramah himself paskins in Siman Reish Gimel and Choshim Mishpat, so maybe in this particular case he would hold that then in fact even in a case of Eino Rogil, as long as there was no Tanai, we don't have to be so super machmir. We can say that even if there would have been a Tanai, it only would be Ribbis D'Rabbanan. So if there's no Tanai, so then maybe it should be Mutar L'Gami. Is there anybody who makes such a bold and audacious argument to say this? Because that's not the way that most people would read the Ramah. Most people would read the Ramah as these are two separate, unconnected statements. That if you hold Tovas Hana'ah as Mammon, it's Ribbis Ketzutza, and since you made a Tanai, and by the way, even if there was no Tanai made, it's still going to be also whether you hold the Tovas Hana'ah as Mammon or whether you hold the Tovas Hana'ah as Eino Mammon. That's the way that I certainly read the Ramah when I read the Ramah the first time, and the second time, and the third time. But there's a Talmid Chacham in Eretz Yisrael by the name of Rav Shmaya Chaduk, who wrote an article in the Or Torah journal, and he cites the Sefer. I didn't look up the Sefer, but there are many Svarim that have been written in the last several years in Hilchos Ribbis. It's hard to keep up with all of them. So one of them is called Ribbis L'Or HaHalacha, and he says that the Sefer Ribbis L'Or HaHalacha makes this argument. And what? Oh, that's the Mechaber of the Sefer Ribbis L'Or HaHalacha. It's a very legitimate Sefer. Yeah, okay. Oh, so he's a Talmid of Avadia. Okay, very good. All right. So he makes this argument to say that if you hold Tovas Hana'ah Eino Mammon, so then it would be Mutar L'Gami as long as there was no Tanai, even if it was an Eino Rogil situation. And he also, interestingly, brings a raya from the Sefer Shardea, the commentary Shardea on Shulchan Aruch, which is a very mainstream commentary to the Shulchan Aruch Yoredea, to be distinguished from the Sefer Sha'arei Deah, which is a different Sefer on Yoredea. But the Sefer Shardea comments on the Ramah, and it sounds from his lashon like he's saying with respect to the Ramah. Oh yeah, the Ramah says this. And by the way, even if you hold Tovas Hana'ah Eino Mammon, it should be Asr because it's Lo Garam and Ribbis Dvarim. Because just like Ribbis Dvarim, for even if there was no stipulation, the borrower, if he never before stopped the Malva in the street and said, good morning, or how are you, or Shalom Aleichem, and now he starts saying it, so it's going to be Asr. So he says, Kol Shekain, if I'm dealing with a Tovas Hana'ah situation, obviously that should be Asr, just the way Ribbis Dvarim is Asr. Even if you hold that Tovas Hana'ah is Eino Mammon, so you'd figure, why are you quoting the Shardea, who clearly is Machmir, even if you hold the Tovas Hana'ah Eino Mammon? So he's quoting the Shardea to say, clearly the Shardea understood that the Ramah wasn't saying that. That's why he had to go further and say, oh, and by the way, even if you hold Tovas Hana'ah Eino Mammon, it's still going to be Asr. So it sounds a little bit like the Shardea understood that the Ramah was only saying that it's Asr according to the Deah that holds that Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon. And the Shita that clearly aligns himself 100% with this conclusion, although he's not obligated necessarily to go along with the Ramah anyways, the Mishnah Lamelech. The Mishnah Lamelech says, Beferish, that if you hold the Tovas Hana'ah Eino Mammon, it's only going to be a problem in the case of a Tanai, but if it was something where there was no actual Tanai, so that doesn't really look so suspicious. It doesn't seem as problematic, because after all, we are talking about an arm's length transaction where the Love is getting a benefit from the Malveh, in addition to paying money for that benefit, but it's a tit for tat, so there really is no loss on the part of the Love. There's no neshek, no tarbis, no harm, no foul, in the event that you hold the Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mammon. Those are the different arguments that he makes in order to present this position. Yes.
Proof from the Mordechai from the Maram about paying for the buffer who was teaching from the closer of Beno, and he's paying for his hotzos, but he did at the time he made the halal, so that was us, even though it was a pay or pay.
Right.
But if he wouldn't have made the mashmos, was I thought the Taz Medayik, that's only when you made the Tanai. You made this whole arrangement at the time of the halva.
And if you wouldn't have made it at the time of the halva, so then it would seem like it would have been much better. That would have been okay. That would have been mutter. So that supports basically the argument that he's making 100%. So he quotes then from the Sefer Malveh Hashem, who disagrees with this interpretation based on the following arguments. Argument number one is that the Stimas Lashon Ramah doesn't seem to distinguish between Tovas Hana'ah Mammon and Tovas Hana'ah Ein Mammon. That most people would read the Ramah the way that I read it. Number two, that if you look at the Ramah in Sif Yud Beis, the Ramah in Sif Yud Beis seems to draw a comparison between the situation of Tovas Hana'ah and Ribbis Devarim, because the Mechaber there says that if the Malveh said to the Loveh, go and let me know when somebody arrives in town, that's Ribbis Devarim, so that's going to be Aser. And the Ramah says, V'chein shar Ribbis Devarim be'alma Aser, v'afilu l'Tovas Hana'ah be'alma. Even if it's something which is Tovas Hana'ah be'alma, so it sounds like he's drawing a comparison, and since we know that Ribbis Devarim is going to be Aser even in a case where there is no Tanai, we hold that it's Aser, so therefore it should follow that the same thing should be true in a case of Tovas Hana'ah as well. And he adds that number three, third reason not to paskin, like the assumption that if we say Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mammon, that if there is no Tanai, then the Loveh should be able to give all of his malacha over to the Malvis, because we see that there are shitos that say explicitly that even if the Ramah held this way, we shouldn't paskin that way, like the Shardea that we quoted. And number four, maybe it's a sveik lahachmir, that number one, that safek, that it's not 100% muchwach that we should hold the Tovas Hana'ah Ein Mammon. When it comes to certain halachos, maybe it's codified that way in the Ramah, but maybe it's a question whether Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon. And even if we assume that Tovas Hana'ah Ein Mammon, maybe we should hold like the Machmirim, like the Shardei, who say that against the Mishnah L'Melech, that it shouldn't make a difference and there should still be Aser. So Rav Chaduk sticks to his guns, and he responds, number one, with respect to the Ramah, don't tell me that the Stimas Lashon Ramah is that it's Aser in all cases, because the Ramah didn't. He could have said. He could have started out a little bit differently, and said that Afilu lo hisnu mitchila, it's going to be Aser, and then bring in the line about if you hold the Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon, it's Ribbis Kitzutza, and the fact that he goes in the order that he goes seems to indicate that it's all interconnected, that the Chumrah about Afilu lo hisnu is only going according to the day of the Tovas Hana'ah is Mammon. And number two, he says, don't draw a comparison to Ribbis Devarim, because Ribbis Devarim is different, because when you do have this Loveh who never said hello, how are you doing, Shalom Aleichem before, and now suddenly starts saying it, so he's being machniya himself. He's subjugating himself to the Malveh, but showing that he's fawning over the Malveh and giving him special kavod and special attention, in which case that's sort of a form of neshech on some level. But here the Lov is losing absolutely nothing. He's paying money for a service and he's receiving the value of the money that he's paying. So therefore, har k'di isei v'har k'di isei, he would have had to give his malacha to somebody to do anyway. And then, furthermore, both the Mishnah Lamelech and Pashtus is, according to the reading of the Levush as well, is that they both seem to say, like this reading of the Ramah as well, that if I would hold that Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mama, the Mishnah Lamelech says it very mefurish, and Levush sounds this way as well, that they both seem to say that you could be makel in these situations. So he concludes that really, in an event, if we are convinced, as we seem to be, that Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mammon, that it should follow that if there was no Tanai, and this would be the majority of transactions that come up nowadays, the Malva loans money to the borrower, and now the borrower, he finds out about the lender. Now he knows that the lender is out there, and that the lender is a handyman, the lender is a plumber, the lender is a carpenter, the lender owns a business, owns a store, whatever it is. The lender provides these services. Now he starts, and he has the relationship anyway with the lender, and he starts giving all of his business over to the lender to perform. So he concludes that you could be meko, but he does finish up his essay with hamachmir tavo la bracha. Okay, just a little cautionary note that since there are machmirim over there, so tavo la bracha, but if you're not interested in an extra bracha, you're not going to get a klala either. So he thinks me'ikar din it would be mutter. Now another point he raises in this entire discussion, which you've been waiting for, obviously, is that there seems to be a Taz who disagrees with this entire halacha. The Taz says that where did you get this from? I mean, the Beis Yosef, the Mechaber seemed to have gotten it from the Rosh, but it was a throwaway line in the Rosh that had nothing to do with giving the Lova giving his malacha to somebody. It was a line about the Lova being a Yisrael who's giving his trumos to a Kohen who's extending a loan to him. That might be a little bit different. If I'm learning from the Rai of the Gra from the Yerushalmi, that's also not necessarily mukwach, because that case of the Mechira had nothing to do with a loan, and who says you have to be medayik that because it's mutter in a sale transaction, it's going to be usher in a loan transaction. And the Taz brings his argument from a halacha which is actually based on a Gemara, because there, as I said, not too many Gemaras that make their way into this discussion, but you have the Gemara on Daf Samachay Beis that says explicitly that if at the time that the loan was extended, the lender received collateral from the borrower, received a house, received a field, and he says to the borrower, oh, so when the time comes that you want to sell this field or this house, so only sell it to me for the amount of money of the loan. So the Gemara says that would be perfectly permissible only in one instance. What would that one instance be? That is in fact the value of the field. If it turns out that the field is worth more than the value of the loan, so then that's going to be prohibited ribbis. But if in fact this is the value of the loan, so then in the event that the borrower wants to sell his field, as this is considered to be a perfectly fine condition, that the borrower will be required to sell it to the lender for the actual value, because again, it's an arm's length transaction for the actual value of the field, and we say that is 100% mutter. So says the Taz, if that's 100% mutter, so it would seem that this should be 100% mutter as well, because it's exactly the same sort of scenario that you're saying. Similarly, that in the event you have work to do to give to somebody, so give it to me, and give it to me at the fair market value, b'shavya, and why should that be usher? And it's different. Even if you want to say, but what about the Rosh? No, it's different from the case of the Rosh, because in the case of the Kohen, the Malva is receiving a real Tova. The Malva is a Kohen, and the Malva is receiving the Trumos. He didn't have to, pay anything for the Trumos. He just extended a loan. He's going to get his money back, plus he's going to get the Trumos. But in this particular case, the Malva is going to get money, but he's going to have to work for his money. He's going to have to provide a service. He's going to have to fix the fellow's sink. He's going to have to repair his deck. He's going to have to provide financial services, whatever it is. He's going to have to sell the goods in his store. And therefore, it's la b'chinam ba'liyado, says the Taz. And you can distinguish between these two cases. Arguably, this is a case where, as the Radbaz puts it, that you would have no neshech and you would have no tarbis. That's how the Radbaz describes the case of the sale of the house or the field that was taken as collateral by the Malva. Why it's okay for the Malva to say to Lova, if you want to sell it to me. That's going to be and that sale will basically be the payment of the loan, because so he says so whatever amount I already gave, that's going to count as the sales price. So he says the reason is mutter. The Radbaz says very eloquently, because the Shabua who ein kan lo neshek v'lo tarbis. And therefore, the Tovas Hana'ah zu adam osa l'chaveru al pi shlo lovim imenu limkol lo b'damim. He says that's a perfectly fine Tovas Hana'ah, where the person is simply getting getting the money for the sale of the field. So the question is, does the Taz really disagree? At the end of the day, the Taz leaves this as a tzarach iyun. Tzarach iyun does not necessarily mean registering a disagreement. It's just because the Taz actually begins his comment by saying lule pekadosh, that if not for the fact that a holy mouth has already paskin in this fashion, I would have found reason to disagree. But that you don't necessarily have the ability to characterize the Taz as disagreeing. So here you have a split amongst the various poskim. Some quote the Taz as outright disagreeing, like for example this Rav Chaduk, and some say, hey, the Taz didn't, like Rabbi Reisman in his Sefer points out, the Taz didn't actually disagree, he just leaves it as a tzarach iyun. So you can't claim that, oh, I'm going to use the Taz as a sniff, because here we have, one opinion that clearly disagrees with the Shulchan Aruch, and I'm going to throw in other things as well. No, you can't throw in other things. He brings a kasha in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, you can reckon with that, give it whatever weight, it deserves, but you can't give the weight of saying, oh, well, I have the Taz on my side, because the Taz didn't necessarily actually paskin this way. But in any event, what do you do with the Bam Kasha of the Taz? The Taz actually brings, a raya from the Gemara, like a Mefurish Gemara, that says that this sort of thing is 100% mutter. So you would have to distinguish between the cases somehow. And the Shacha gives two different distinctions between the two different cases in the Nekudos HaKesef. So one distinction that the Shacha gives is that the case of the Karka is different. Because the case of the Karka is already Tachas Yodo. It's already in the possession of the Malveh. So the Nisef and Nesiva Shalom presses a little bit on this, because that's all the Shach says. It's a very terse comment in the Nekudos HaKesef. So the Nisef and Nesiva Shalom of Shalom Yosef Gelber says, why does this matter? Who cares? That's already in the possession of the Malveh. Why does that make it any better? So he says a couple of things. He says, well, it could be that if you hold Tovas Hana'ah ein mamon, what is the whole problem over here anyway? What is the problem? If Tovas Hana'ah mamon, I understand. So it's as if the Malveh is getting a monetary value. If Tovas Hana'ah ein mamon, so why should this be aser? And it's clear that it's aser even if you hold the Tovas Hana'ah ein mamon. That's what the Rosh is saying explicitly. So the whole problem, he says, is mexi Ribbis. And once the item already starts out being in the Malveh's possession, so it's less mexi Ribbis. It doesn't look like the Malveh is grabbing something away from the loan in return for the loan, because the Malveh already has it. That's his explanation. That's one possible explanation. Another possible explanation is, and this is found in the Kunteras Asma, that the Malveh would have bar mitzvah rights anyway. That once it's in the possession of the Malveh, so then he would have the right anyway to have a first dibs or right of first refusal in the event that the lover would want to sell it. So therefore, there's nothing new that is being added with respect to this condition. But of course, the kasha with respect to that particular explanation is that bar mitzvah rights don't always apply across the board. There are lots of exceptions to bar mitzvah rights. Somebody else is willing to pay more, and whatever it is. So that's a little bit harder to fathom. Maybe the first explanation is a little bit easier. But if you follow that explanation, so then the case of the Sadeh that appears in the Gemara that's codified in Siman Kuf Ayin Beis in Shulchan Aruch would really stand very much alone. It would be a sui generis type of a case where only when you had a mashkon that was already in the possession of the Malveh would it not be a problem. But every other case where there was a stipulation, even an arm's length transaction where fair value is being given, and the love is giving over all of his work to the Malveh, and paying the Malveh and getting the fair value of the payment from the Malveh, that would all be aser. Similarly, if you follow the explanation of the Chabas Das, before we get to the second teretz of the Nekudas HaKesef, I'll go a little out of order. The Chabas Das gives a different answer, which is that the advantage of the case in the Gemara of the field that's being held as collateral is that the loan transaction is effectively being transformed into a sale transaction, that it will turn out retroactively that the money wasn't really loan money, because once the borrower decides to sell it, so what do you know? That abracadabra, the loan has magically turned into a sale. And the money that was originally extended, since now the borrower has decided that he's going to allow the field to be sold, the whole discussion there, whether it's only if you say me'akshav, you don't say me'akshav, that's really a detail, that the property is being transferred over really as a sale transaction. But in all of these cases, the loan continues to be viable. The loan remains intact and remains in place, and you have this separate service agreement that is being provided for the malveh. So therefore, that's going to be problematic. According to that explanation of the Chaburah has a kula, which is that since it's a sale transaction based upon the value of the property that was already in the hands of the lover at the time that the stipulation was made of the value, even if it would go up in value afterwards, think about situations of psika, even if it would go up in value afterwards, it would still be a perfectly valid transaction. But okay, so according to those explanations, then that particular case would stand alone. But then the shach has a second teretz. Second teretz of the shach, there's a little bit more nuance. The shach says that the difference is that in this particular case, with respect to the business, the malveh is getting something that he is entirely new, meaning that he's getting a value that he wouldn't necessarily have had access to. That when it comes to buying a field, so the malveh is not getting any new value. He had the money before. He had the money, and now he has a field that's worth that amount of money. So there's nothing new in terms of the value that he had. He had, something that he had $100,000 in his possession, and now he has a field that's worth $100,000. So he's not getting anything new of a value in this particular case. However, when it comes to business, who says that he would have gotten the business? A business person has to be very industrious. You have to do a lot of advertising, word of mouth. You have to promote your brand and so forth. Who knows if you would have gotten any plumbing jobs, any dentistry jobs, any carpenting jobs this particular month? Maybe your competitors would have gotten everything. Maybe maybe you would have been left out in the cold. So therefore, in this particular case, by securing the love's business, the malveh is getting something that he wasn't necessarily assured of having, and it's not as if that he had something tangible in his possession that was worth the same value. If you're out of work, it's not like you say, oh, that's great because I already have my salary. No, you don't already have your salary. You don't even have the equivalent of your salary. You have the ability to do your work. That's great. You have the ability, but that's not going, and $2 or whatever will buy you a subway ticket, whatever it costs nowadays. But the ability itself is not any kind of value that you can cash in. You're going to go to a restaurant and say, well, I don't have a credit card with me. I don't have any money, but, I have the ability to do work. I say, well, we don't want your work. So it doesn't count for anything. So therefore, he's getting a direct benefit in this particular case, as opposed to the case of the field where the malveh had money before, and now he's just getting field, which is worth that amount of the money. So this second approach of the shach would allow for a kula in the following two cases, as the Nesiva Shalom points out. Let's say that number one, the lover, that you have a condition that the lover is going to sell a certain chayfetz to the malveh. So if that would be the condition, when the malveh says, and let's assume this chayfetz was for sale. If it wasn't for sale, obviously it's a different story. But let's assume the lover had a certain chayfetz for sale, and there was a market price. He was asking for it, and the malveh says, I will pay this particular price. So in this particular case, where the lover says, okay, rather than sell it to somebody else, I'll sell it to you. That's perfectly fine because the lover is not losing anything, and the malveh is not getting any kind of a benefit of an additional value over what he has because he's paying market value. He has the money in his possession already. He's paying market value for this particular chayfetz. So according to the second teretz of the shach, this would be perfectly permissible. Secondly, the case of the gra would be perfectly permissible. The gra in Siman Kufa Samach Ches extends, Kuf Samach Zayin, Sivkat and Aleph extends this halacha that we have in Siman Kuf Samach with respect to the malveh who makes the condition that the borrower is going to give all of his work to the malveh, that's usher. He says that the reverse case is also usher. If the malveh says that you lover, I know that you're a carpenter and I have a lot of work that I need done on my deck. You might have a long list of people that you're planning to service and so forth. I want to be bumped to the top of the list. That any time that I need work to be done, since you're somebody who's a practitioner of this work, you're somebody who fixes decks, you're somebody who fixes bathrooms, you're somebody who is a good plumber, and I have plumbing problems in my house. Anytime that I need something to be fixed, you're going to come over and I'm going to pay you. I'll pay you market price, but no problem with that. But this says the gra is going to be usher exactly in the same way. The same way that I'm not allowed to go and tell somebody if I give a loan to them that I want you to work for me, right? You're not allowed to do that. If you're just going to extend a loan to somebody and say that I want you to work for me. So the gra is very, very emphatic that even the idea that you extend money to somebody and they're going to invest your money and you're going to pay them schar tircha is only on something which we would allow in the context of an iska transaction. It's not something that we would allow in the context of a regular loan transaction. And the Vilna Gaon says, and the same thing would be true in terms of the scenario in Kuf Samach. Look at the end of the Vilna Gaon. He quotes, he says, "V'hu adin," this is source Yud Beis in the source sheets, "V'hu adin lehepech, she'amana shekol malacha she'iten love, she'kabel mimenu," that if the lova would agree to do any work that the malveh asks to be done, even though the malveh is prepared to pay full market value for it, gam kein aser, that also is going to be aser. So in the case of the gra, if you think about it, this is not a case where I have a person who's capable of rendering work, but it's just that he's not going to get any value if nobody hires him, which is the case that we have in the Shulchan Aruch, but it's somebody who has money, but he just needs some work done on his behalf, so he's going to be swapping the money for the work, but he's not going to be getting any additional value because he already has the money. He already has the money. So it says in the Siva Shalom, since in this particular case, the malveh already has the money, that's the gross scenario, the Vilna Gaon scenario, which the Vilna Gaon says would be aser, according to the second teretz of the Shach, should in fact be mutter. He's mesupuk about the following case. If you take a look in the bottom of page 2, source test, he said that b'yesh la'ayin, he said, okay, I'm pretty convinced about these two cases that they would be mutter according to the second teretz of the Shach, but he says yesh la'ayin, even if teretz hasheni shanakudas hakesef, yehi rashayim malveh la'asnos imalove shalove yikna mimenu chayfetz. What if it's the opposite scenario? Not that the malveh is going to buy the chayfetz of the love, but the love should buy the chayfetz of the malveh. The malveh has the Mona Lisa, and he says that it's worth, $55 billion or whatever, and I want you to buy it for the $55 billion. Bill Gates, whatever, okay? He's just somebody who has the money, and he says, so in this particular case, since he has a chayfetz, but he doesn't have money, if you go to Sotheby's, and nobody's going to auction on this thing, so even a Mona Lisa is something you just throw out in the trash can. It's only worth something because people are willing to pay money for it, okay? Otherwise, I could draw a mysterious, woman with a mysterious expression as well. So therefore, that's not necessarily kesef that the person has in their hands, that they're just exchanging for something that's clearly of no future value. So he says maybe that's not considered to be considered b'shivyo in such a case. Or let's say that the malveh owns a store. And in the store, he has lots of different items. He has cream cheese and he has cold cereals and whatever else. If nobody buys them, they're going to, I don't know, cold cereal, but the cream cheeses will certainly go bad. Somebody ate cold cereal like 25 years after its expiration date, apparently by accident, and he was perfectly fine. So this was like a member story that came out last year. But let's say it's cream cheeses or whatever, and they're going to go bad anyway. So here it's really worth something to the malveh that the loveh, that somebody should come along and buy it. So let's say the condition is that the loveh will come and he'll buy from the store of the malveh. From now on, he's going to only go to the grocery store of the malveh. So maybe this really is adding a value. Maybe we wouldn't say that the chayfetz is considered to be like actual case kesef. So he leaves this as sort of like a tzarach iyun. Ha'im neima dekemen shim afim alova lo yikna mikomakom yisharach hafetzim b'shuso shel alove shel malveh. do we say that even if even if the Lova wouldn't buy it, the Malva would still have it? Memela, this would be similar to the Gemara regarding the purchase of the field, where the Malva is just swapping money for a field. And therefore it should not be prohibited. Or do we say no, since he didn't have money before, he just had the cream cheese, and now he's actually getting money for it. The fact that otherwise he's going to end up just with unsold cream cheese, that's not considered to be a swap. It's not considered to be an exact exchange. So he leaves that as a sort of a tzarach iyan within these distinctions of what would be permitted, at least according to the second teretz of the Nekudas HaKesef. So it's with this backdrop that the Maskanas Hadrarim later on in the Nesiva Shalom is a little bit more understood. So I don't think I wrote down these words, but I'll tell you what he says. The Nesiva Shalom, at the end of his discussion regarding this sip, so he comes to the following conclusions. He says that in the case of a love who has, let's say, a chaypetz to sell, and it's a case where lo hisnu, okay, where there was no original tanai, because remember, all of these nafkaminos that the Shach is talking about in response to the Taz is talking about a case where there is a Tanai. So let's go back to our original discussion of the case where there is no actual Tanai. And remember, according to the way that we paskin, the Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mammon, where we have this Rav Chaduk and the Mishnah Lamelech who are prepared to say, oh, well, everything should be mutter anyway in that case. So he says that if I have this combination of circumstances, that it is, number one, a case of a love who has a chaypetz to sell, and the Malva says, I want to buy your chaypetz, and the Shach said explicitly that according to, not the Shach, the Nesiva Shalom said, according to the second teretz of the Shach, this should be 100% mutter. Again, not according to the first teretz of the Shach, not according to the Chavas Das's explanation, but certainly according to the second explanation of the Shach. So he throws in that if I had a low hisnu situation, then it would be perfectly fine for the Malva to walk into the Lova store and to buy the chaypetz, just like anybody else could walk into the store and buy the chaypetz. And so too, if the Lova walks into the Malva store to buy a chaypetz, now remember, this was the case that he was a little uncertain about, but he thought that there was a possible argument to say, certainly in the cold cereal case, right, this is going to last longer. There's certainly an argument to make that this is also just a swapping of things of equal value, the chaypetz for money, the money for chaypetz. So he said he thinks that this should be fine as well, unless the love knows that he's doing it only because of the loan, that he's doing it only because he wants to butter up the Malva and buy from his store because of the loan. But if he's doing it otherwise, let's say because now he knows about the Malva, and that's why he's walking into his store, or he doesn't have the mindset that he's doing it just because of the loan, so then that would be okay. But in the case of giving all of his malachos to the Malva, so there he says it's only mutter in the event that the love is in a situation where he's in a bind and there's no other plumber in town. There's no other carpenter in town. He needs to buy a 2x4 in order to build his sukkah, and the only one who owns a Home Depot in town happens to be the Malva. That there's nobody else that he could possibly buy it from. But if there's somebody else he can buy it from, even if he doesn't have the mindset that I'm doing it because of the loan, so then he still would not allow the Lovet to do it under these circumstances. So I would suggest, he doesn't say this, but I would suggest that maybe the idea that he's conveying over here is that I have a tarti letivusa on some level. I have, number one, that these are cases that fall into the category of the second teretz of the Shach, or at least where you're buying a chaypetz in the Malva, arguably within the second teretz of the Shach. And number two, you also have a situation of lo hitnu, where there was no actual tanai, where, as we've seen, there certainly are poskim who are prepared to be make across the board, since we hold the Tovas Hana'ah in a moment when there is no actual tanai. So you could also go further and say that according to what we quoted from the Shardea, that there would be a possible kula in the event that all of this happens, meaning the purchase of the goods from, let's say, the Malva store, or potentially even giving over all of your malacha to the Malva when there was no tanai. All of this might be more lenient, or there might be more room for leniency in the event that we're talking about when it is a Ribbis Milcheres type situation, when the loan was already paid up. I didn't see anybody explicitly address this issue of, does this become a more lenient issue after the loan is already paid up? Because we know there is such a thing as Ribbis Milcheres, right? Now, of course, if it's like not immediately after the loan was paid, there's more room for leniency. But if it's something which is meruba, so then we're going to be machmir even by Ribbis Milcheres. But one area where we're very makel when it comes to Ribbis Milcheres is what? Is Ribbis Dvarim. Ribbis Dvarim, we have a general principle there. There's no problem whatsoever once the loan has already been paid. So according to Sharadei, who says, hey, lo garami Ribbis Dvarim, that the reason why you should be machmir, even if you hold Tovas Hana'ah in a mammon, and there is no tanayas because it's lo garami Ribbis Dvarim, so maybe there's room to be makel in all of the cases if the loan has already been paid up. Now, just, full disclosure, if you look at the actual lashon of the Sharadei, he says, well, lo garim and Ribbis Dvarim, the kol shekain, where I have Tovas Hana'ah. So since he throws in the kol shekain Tovas Hana'ah, I can't say categorically, based on his lashon, to be makel in such a case. But then again, the Ramah's language in Sif Yud Beis seems to be very much the opposite, where he seems to say in Sif Yud Beis that v'chein shar Ribbis Dvarim is aser ba'afilu the Tovas Hana'ah b'alma. And then when he says ba'afilu Tovas Hana'ah b'alma, k'moshi yisbar b'sofa siman, well, k'moshi yisbar b'sofa siman is our case. That is the sofa siman case, but the main case anyway, at the beginning of this sif, with respect to Tovas Hana'ah. So the Ramah seems to say, well, this is even more of a chiddush than the case of Ribbis Dvarim. And on some level, we said it really is, because the case of Ribbis Dvarim, as we said, the person, as Rav Chaduk said, the lova is being machnia himself to Malva. Well, here I have an arm's length transaction, so it kind of maybe offsets each other, these different arguments. Seems to me, if you want to be makel, there's a little bit more room to be makel in a low hisnu situation, even in a situation where the lova is now going to give all of his malacha over to the Malva, if we're talking about after the loan was already paid. So that's just something that I'll throw out there. Now there is another Chavas Das in Siman Kuf Samach Ches Sivkatan Lamedalid, where he seems to argue that there is another distinction between the two different cases, and this is also something I guess that's worth pondering, which is that the Maleh, in the case of the field, is that the way in which the Malveh is presenting the condition is, he says, in the event that you want to sell the field, just sell the field to me. Meaning that it's not muchlach that the lova has to sell the field at all. He still maintains control over whether he's going to sell the field. As opposed to this formulation of a kol malacha, the shitavo liyado, that any malacha that you have, you're going to give to me, that's more of an inevitability, because it is, and that's the Chelkas Binyamin suggests this, although he doesn't necessarily make a big deal out of it. He just kind of suggests this in passing, but he suggests that maybe this lashon is meduyuk, that it's kol malacha shetava liyado, because it creates more of an inevitability that the lova is going to have malacha to give over to the malveh, as opposed to if you happen to want to buy, a particular chayfetz, you'll buy that from me, or you want to, have a particular type of malacha, so then you'll come to me. But when it's called malacha, so then it becomes something which is more of an absolute obligation that's being imposed upon the lova. So that also is something that I would suggest you can throw into the mix, that the less you have a tanai which creates sort of an inevitability that something has to be given over to the malveh. It's more like, if you decide you want to sell this chayfetz, then sell it to me. If you decide that you want to buy this brand of cream cheese, so just buy it from me. So that probably also would diminish of the extent of the prohibition, even on this d'Rabbanan level that we're talking about. Now the Machaneh Ephraim in Siman Chaf in Hilchos Ribbis understands that we're talking about a totally different type of case, and the way that he understands it fits in much better with the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch, because the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch is hamav emos almanas she. Wait, hold that thought. That this lashon actually works out better according to something I'm going to say afterwards. But the Machaneh Ephraim has a different explanation of what we're talking about over here. The Machaneh Ephraim says that the lova himself is a Baal Malacha, because he says, if I'm talking about a situation where the lova himself is not a Baal Malacha, so the lova is clearly getting a benefit by giving over Malacha for the Malva to fix his kitchen sink when he's not able to do it himself, and therefore he says that what possible loss is the lova having when he definitely needs to fix his sink anyway, and he's just giving over the Malacha to the Malva, and he's getting the benefit of the Malacha, and he's just paying whatever happens to be the going rate. It's not as if he would be entitled to receive money for that on any level, but he says that in the event that what we're really talking about is where the lova is a Baal Malacha, and where the lova is forfeiting his ability to do the work that he would do himself, and he's saying that any kind, even though he would be able to do the work himself, he's going to give it over to the malveh under those circumstances. So there, where he could have been the one to do the work, and instead he's going to give over the work to the malveh to do instead. So there he really is forfeiting a value that he could have received in terms of work. But this would imply that it's somebody else's work. So I guess this does fit into what I was about to say, which is, if you look at the Lashon of the Shulchan Aruch, Hamav mos amanashiko malacha shetavu liyado yitin osa l'mava la'asosa. So this Lashon would work out very well, actually, according to this explanation, which is that the lova is basically giving over malacha that he could have done himself or a third party, and he's giving over that malacha to the malva to do instead. Even though that's a very nice explanation that works out well according to the wording anyway, but it's clear from context that the Mechaber never indicates, certainly in the Beis Yosef, that this is the scenario that he's talking about, even though that might be the wordsmithing that he came up with, Kol malacha shetavu liyado, but the way that it's understood by 99% of the Meforshim is that it means malacha that the lova needs performed, as opposed to a malacha that the lova could have performed for somebody else, and now he's giving it over to the malveh. In fact, Rav Moshe Feinstein points out that there is a clear scenario where it would be what we would call Ribbis Ketzutza, and that would be a scenario where the lova essentially is a broker. And this also fits well with the Lashon of the Shulchan Aruch, Kol malacha shetavu liyado, where the lova gets paid, not that the lova is a Baal Malacha himself, but where the lova is a broker, that he is somebody who makes a shidduch between people who need the work done and somebody who's capable of providing that work. That's what brokers do, right? And he gets paid a fee. He gets paid a fee for that service. So here, instead of the malveh having to pay the fee that everybody else would have to pay to this broker, to this lova, to be able to get the job that the lova is bringing to him, so he's being excused from that fee. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, that's not just Tovas Hana'ah, that's Ribbis Gomer, because here we're talking about actual money. That is the actual money that this lova, that this individual is always going to get paid by serving as a broker. So he says in that scenario, for sure, that's going to be not merely on a Ribbis D'Rabbanan level. Even if I hold Tovas Hana'ah in a moment, this is not Tovas Hana'ah, this is actual moment. This is actual moment in such a case. Now, is there anyone else besides Rav Chaduk who would be Mekel in our case, where Eino Rogel, despite the Lashon of the Ramah? We already quoted the Mishnah Lamelech. So you take a look at the Mishnah Lamelech in source, hold on, 19, source Yud Tes on page 6. So he says over here, V'im lo hisne b'shas hava u'v'tochas man motze lases lo malacha. And within this man of the loan, the lova decides he wants to give malacha for the malveh to perform near the leman damar Tovas Hana'ah mamon ime'eno ragil aser, that if you hold Tovas mamon, it's going to be aser. Leman damar de'eno mamon shari. So he says explicitly that it's going to be permitted. So certainly, as we pointed out, he does have that colleague over here. Now if you have if you have as well the Torah's Ribbis. The Torah's Ribbis speaks about this particular scenario where I have now the sheet of the Mishnah Melech who's machmir. I have the shar who's mekel. Excuse me. I have the sheet of the Sharadea who is machmir about this. The pashtus of the Ramah, I thought, was that the Ramah was machmir as well. So he quotes this as a machlokis. He says the case of lo hisnu and eino ragil. And he's talking about, the Torah's Ribbis is talking about, even when it's the case where all the malacha of the lova is going to be given over to the malveh, he says it's a machlokis. And the strange part about the Torah's Ribbis, I have to tell you, is that he doesn't quote the Ramah. He doesn't, which, I mean, the Ramah seems to be only about this. He says, well, the Shulchan Aruch Harav is machmir, which is true. If you take a look in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which is in source Yud Zayin, so he says clearly that it's this would be aser. He says, "Filo Tovas Hana'ah she'ena maman aser lehanos mimenu." He says, "Ve'ein tzarech lomar she'aser l'misharis u'malamed la'avos mos l'bal habayis kadei she'yizkaru." And included in this is that you can't have like a malamed extending a loan to somebody on condition that he's going to be hired as like a tutor for that person's student, or he's going to be the music teacher for that person's that person's child, I should say. But so he says that is clearly bafilo im kvar hilveu shlo adas l'socho. Even if the loan already took place, aser l'socho achar kach, it would be aser for the lover to hire this individual to tutor his son and so forth. If he would not have hired him before the loan had taken place. So he's very, very clear about this, that even if it's an eno ragil type of a situation, that it would be usher even in the case of low hitnu. And the machlokes there seems to be a little bit of a machlokes about what is the opinion of the chachmas adam when it comes to this situation. The Torah's Ribbis quotes the chachmas adam as being amongst the mekilim, and in the Sefer Mishpat Ribbis by Rav Yona Reiss. So he says, I have a hard time with the Torah's Ribbis being incredibly makel about this situation. But I'm really, but I'm very, very troubled by the fact that he is even that he quotes the Chachmas Adam as being on his side when the Chachmas Adam clearly holds that in the case of lo hisnu and lo ragil, it would still be aser. What does the Chachmas Adam actually say? So I leave it to your interpretation as to who's right with respect to the reading of the Chachmas Adam. If you take a look in Sif Chav, Melamed shehilva mos balabayis gam lomin ben balabayis v'hisna imo she'itin lo hotzal, said that okay, well, whatever. Hold on, let me move this. I think that this is the case of the Chachmas Adam. He says, so he says if he's going to make a condition when he loans him the money that he's going to have to hire him and so forth, so it's going to be asav hilvelo stam. But if he gave the loan stam and then afterwards he was hired to buy the love to learn with the love's son, it was not part of the stipulation. So he quotes the Lavush who says it's mutter shekain derech balabayis lahasnos l'malamed v'shas halava lo hisna lo imo klum. So he quotes the Lavush who says that it would be mutter. Why would it be mutter? Because this is the general. This is what is generally done, that a balabayis will make a tanai with a malamed. And that he's going to pay for his mizonos and so forth, but he didn't make any tanai at the time, so therefore it's going to be permissible. So the Torah's Ribbis, I think, assumed from this that since he's quoting the Lavush, that as long as there was no tanai at the time of the actual hava, so then that should be perfectly fine. And I think that the Mishpat Ribbis was focusing upon the first line of the Chachmas Adam, which was Malamed Shehova Mos LaBalabais V'Gam Lomin in Ben Balabais. They were talking about a Malamed who's already learning with the child. It's just that he hadn't made the Tanai yet that he's going to get Hotzos for the amount of time that he's teaching the child, but he's already ragil. He already has this relationship with the Malamed, so maybe that's why the machlokes hinges upon what's considered to be ragil and ain't a ragil. If he already had the relationship, so therefore, if he's going to add something afterwards in terms of paying hotzos, since that's sort of a standard thing that you do with a malamed anyway, So Kain Derech Balabayis Lahasos Malamed, and this person was already serving as the Malamed, so that doesn't necessarily teach me, if there was no working relationship between the two of them altogether, that there would be greater room for leniency. On the other hand, this particular arrangement wasn't a regular arrangement, that the Balabayis wasn't already paying for the mizonos of the Malamed before he extended the loan. So I think you could probably read the Chokmas Adam either way, meaning I can see basically the arguments of each side when it comes to this particular interpretation of the Chokmas Adam. But in any event, I did see in the Bris Yehuda in Parakid Aleph in Sifkat and Nun Hey that he doesn't talk about the Kol Malachah Yabal Liyado situation, but he does say that if you had a situation where it was lo hisnu, so he says that as long as there was no Tanai that was made at the time of the loan, even if the borrower, let's say that the lender owns a store, and the borrower never used to come to the store before, says that it would be mutter for the borrower to now go to the store and buy things, and it would also be mutter for the borrower to sell things to the lender, even though he didn't sell things to him before, and he issues no qualification whatsoever, and doesn't explain why he seems to be poskening against the Ramah. But here too, I would say that the Bris Yehuda is a little bit more readily understandable than the Torah's Ribbis, because similar to the Nesiva Shalom, he's talking about situations that would seem to at least satisfy the criteria of the second teretz of the Shach. That namely, you're talking about either frequenting the Malvis store, which we said was, at least a suffix in the Shach, that the suffix in the Nesiva Shalom had, that according to the Shach, maybe that should be permissible. It's just swapping one object of value for money. And certainly the idea of selling something to the Malveh would be something that we would readily understand would be permissible, because the Malveh is starting out with money in that case, and therefore he's certainly not getting anything of greater value than the money when he's paying the fair market value for the item that he's going to receive, and there was no actual Tanai. So since that's a scenario where arguably you can say that it should be mutter altogether, even if it was stipulated, based on the second teretz of the Shach. So certainly if there was no stipulation, there would be more room to be makel in those cases. So I more readily understand the Bris Yehuda but the Torah's Ribbis is not picking sides. He's just saying that it's a machlokis poskim. And the interesting thing about the Torah's Ribbis is that he is not quoting the Ramah at all in this machlokis, and he is attributing to the Chokmas Adam the same kula that would be attributed to the Mishnah Lamelech. Okay, now one other very important caveat that the Nesiva Shalom talks about, which is that whether we're dealing with a situation where the Lova is going to give all the malacha to the Malveh, whether he's going to give only some of the malacha to the Malveh, everyone would agree that it would be mutter, even in a case of Eino Ragil, when it's coming from the Lova. And that was sort of the Nesiva Shalom saying that the Lova is desperate. There's no other place where he can find a plumber in town, and the Malveh happens to be the plumber. So that's not something that's being done in order to benefit the Malveh. We know for sure that's being done to benefit the Lova, because there is no other plumber in town. There is no other store in town other than the Malveh store, the Home Depot, even though the Lova never shopped in the Home Depot before. But now he needs a 2x4. The only place he can get is the Home Depot. So everyone would agree that under those circumstances, it would be okay. There's no other Baal Malacha to do something that he suddenly needs. The only doctor in town happens to be the doctor who extended the loan, who has this particular specialty. So what are you going to say? That the Lovik shouldn't be allowed to take advantage of the best urologist in town because, he never needed a urologist before, and this is the best urologist who happened to extend the loan to him. So everybody would agree that would be okay. So in this sense, this halacha also depends upon the direction that it goes. So for example, Nesiva Shalom gives the following case, and some of the other Meforshim talk about this as well. I think the Osa Hilchos Ribbis talks about this too. Let's say you have a store he does. Let's say you have a store, in fact, that's source Chop Aleph in the Osa Hilchos Ribbis. You have a grocery store that extends credit for anyone who makes a certain purchase over a certain amount of money. So if you buy $200 worth of groceries, so then instead of having 1 week to pay, you'll have 3 weeks to pay. Or instead of having to pay right away, you'll be able to pay over a 2-week period. You're going to extend credit to you under these circumstances. I'm not going to you're not going to pay $210 at the end of the 2 weeks. You'll still just pay the $200, but he's extending credit. In other words, he's turning the sale transaction into a loan transaction under those circumstances. So is that permissible, or do we say that no, this is basically a loan transaction from the store owner to the purchaser, that he's loaning him these $200, for 2 weeks on condition that he's going to buy from his store? So it says in the Sira Shalom, no, because you got it completely mixed up. You got it reversed. This isn't a situation where the lover, the customer, walked into the store and said, I want a loan. And the seller said, oh, you want a loan? So then I'm going to require you to buy merchandise. This is a case where the customer walks into the store to buy merchandise. And as a result of his buying merchandise, the owner of the store is extending this credit that if you buy a certain amount of merchandise, a certain amount of groceries, so you'll get a loan. Since it's starting out basically as a sale transaction as opposed to a loan transaction, so this is going to be perfectly permissible. Look at the Yosef Hilchos Ribbis, his source Chafal. He says the same thing. The kol sheken shemuter lechenvanim liten ashray lekuchosa shlo yishamalo b'mezuman. He's not loaning him money in order for the borrower to buy from him. It's in an opposite direction. The borrower wants to buy from him, and he's the one who's saying, okay, so I'm agreeing to wait for the money. There's a raya from the Gemara. The Gemara in Daf Ayin Beis, Amud Beis, the Sira Shalom points to this halacha. You have the porters who come along and they see that there's somebody who has merchandise. He's taking from a cheap place to a place where the merchandise is going to be sold more expensively. And he says, give it to me and I'll pay you back, the amount that you would get in the more expensive place. That's usher. But if the person who had the merchandise originally takes the achrayus for the merchandise until the merchandise is moved by the porters to the place where they're going to sell it, and only after it's sold, and then it basically becomes a loan transaction, when the porters are going to receive the money for selling the merchandise, does it become a loan and their responsibility to have to pay back the money to the merchant that gave them the merchandise in the first place? So that would be perfectly permissible. So says Tosas, yeah, it's perfectly permissible, but only if he didn't make them do work for him for nothing, because they were carrying the merchandise. So he's going to have to pay them for the schar tircha. He's going to have to pay them for the schar tircha that they're carrying his merchandise. So why isn't this usher? Because after all, they're borrowing money, and they're getting and they're getting work. And the person who is the person loaned them money, and he's saying, and you're working. He's having them work for him, even though he's paying them fair market value, but he's having them work for him. So why isn't that usher? So the reason it's not usher, and this is codified in Shulchan Aruch Siman Kufay and Gimel. The reason it's not usher, explains in the Sira Shalom, is because he's not asking them to do the work. They wanted to do the work. That's why they approached him in the first place. They wanted to take the merchandise so they could sell the merchandise in a more expensive location. So this is, I think, a raya muchachas. It's a very, very strong raya as to why this particular case should be mutter. In fact, the Yosef Hilchos Ribbis says in his second paragraph, he says, "Utzmuim tivei mishe merabenus manenu shekasu lefakbek b'zeh." Points out that there are those who want to be machmir in this particular situation about the grocer who is going to give this loan, this credit period of a couple of weeks to people who buy more than a certain amount of groceries. So he says, no, that is a wrong-headed approach. In one case, the person is, by giving their business, they're paying back for the loan. But here, this is a hava that comes about because of the sale transaction in the first place. The ikar is the sale transaction. So therefore, this was never asert, especially when you think about this being really in the realm of chumrah, from our perspective, based on, since we owe Tovas Hana'ah in a mammon, the only thing that the grocer has to be careful about is not to say, oh, well, it would have cost you $200, but because I'm giving you a 2-week grace period, now it's going to cost you $210. But other than that, that should be heter gomer. Okay, so another heter would be based on the fact that since it's never going to be any worse than Ribbis the Rabbanon, So therefore, you're going to have a heter in a situation when you're dealing with, let's say, a gemach organization. So this is something the Nesivos Olam points to as well. Let's say somebody wants to receive a loan for a substantial amount of money from a gemach organization. The gemach says to him, fine, we're happy to give you the loan, provided that you pay us your meiser money that you've already set aside as meiser. Okay, you set aside meiser, it has to go somewhere. So you're getting a benefit from us, so we want you to pay your meiser money to us. So is that something which is permissible? So Tovas Hana'ah says, well, it depends. If the person has not yet set aside his meiser money, so then it's not considered this is already something which is out of their possession. This is actual mammon. But if they've already pledged money, say I'm pledging the following amount of tzedakah, they've already put it in their official meiser ksafim account. They now have these special accounts that people create and so forth. So it's going to have to go to some tzedakah organization anyway. So in this particular case, it's not going to be any worse than an Issur D'Rabbanan, like the case of asking the Kohen to give over his trumos. So if it is as this situation where it's a tzedakah organization, he thinks that this would be 100% permissible. So that I think is another interesting chiddush, but it makes a lot of sense since it's never going to be worse than a Ribbis D'Rabbanan, and we hold that Ribbis D'Rabbanan is going to be a mutter for tzedakah organizations. Now, the sister analog to, well, yes, go ahead, Mordechai.
They contractually obligate a mora to donate 10% of her earnings to the school. That would be usher.
Yes, that would be usher. That would be usher. Here it has to be something that, as I said, was already basically pledged. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so then we have to be very, you have to be very careful about that. Right. Okay. There was an interesting discussion about what if a person, if you take a look at the Osa Hilchos Ribbis, the source base, that you already have a ruggle situation. Here it comes to the question of was this what the Chachmas Adam was talking about, that you could be mekel if there was no Tanai, but here there actually is a Tanai, so it's much worse. You have a Malveh who is already working for the Loveh, and the Loveh needed money. The Malveh, I guess, had more ready cash, was more liquid than the Loveh. So the Malveh, even though he needs to be employed by the Loveh, but the Malveh is more liquid than the Loveh, right? So he says, look, I'm your employee. I know that you're not so liquid right now and you need some funds. I'll give you some funds on condition that you don't fire me. On condition that you don't fire me. So he quotes for Chaim Apalaji in his Shuvas Chaim Biyad, that this is 100% permissible. Why is it 100% permissible? Because he says this is like a situation where he was like Rogil beforehand, because he's already working for him. So I think you can make an argument if he's Rogil beforehand that you can have all kinds of leniencies, but not if it's part of the condition. Nobody, not the Mechaber, not the Ramah, is lenient in these cases of this scenario of Kol Malacha Shetavo Liyado and so forth if it's part of an explicit Tanai. It's part of an explicit Tanai, so then that's much more problematic. If it's something new that the person is getting as a benefit, if it's something, you make a Tanai with respect to something which a person is supposed to do anyway, say like the Ritva's case. I'm loaning you money, I'll Tanai that you pay me back that gezel that you stole from me. That's perfectly okay. I'm loaning you money, I'll Tanai that you keep Shabbos. I'll Tanai that you keep Shabbos. You're obligated to keep Shabbos anyway. You're not doing me any favors. That's perfectly permissible. The poskim actually talk about these scenarios. But here, points out the Osa Hilchos Ribbis, you're getting something new. That beforehand, it's true that there was a relationship, that this Malva was already working for the Loveh, so there was an employment relationship, so there'll be nothing wrong with saying, I'll give you the money on condition that you hire me. Well, he already hired him, so it doesn't mean anything. But on condition you don't fire me, hey, a lot of these, businesses have an employee at will, type of arrangement. That's a very big benefit to have an agreement not to be fired, that you're not going to be an employee at will anymore. So therefore, the Osa Hilchos Ribbis says that in all due deference to the Chaim Biyad, I think that this is 100% Ribbis, because this is a suchus she'ein l'kol poel v'hu mekabla b'scharo ba'oso. He's only getting the right not to be fired because of the fact that he extended a loan. Therefore, he says that clearly would be problematic. Now, when this sort of thing happens, how much has to actually be paid in terms of any kind of compensation? So here, there's a Maharsham. The Maharsham actually figures out a formula that's a source Yudalit in the materials. where there was a malamed that loaned money to Baal Abayis, and it was on condition that the sons of this Baal Abayis, who were currently learning with a different malamed, would switch over and learn with this malamed, so this malamed would make more money, even though he's just getting paid for. He goes into the question, maybe it's only schar b'tol, but at the end of the day, Lamaisi says he's getting paid. He's getting paid for the service that he's providing. It's an arm's length transaction, but he's getting paid for something he wasn't doing beforehand. He's getting additional business. So we say getting the additional business would for sure be problematic. So he says, look at the third paragraph. He says that it would only be according to that what amount needs to be disgorged. It's not the entire amount that was paid, because given that it was an arm's length transaction, and at the end of the day, the Malamed taught the children he was entitled to be paid whatever was at the market going rate, he can keep that market going rate. The only thing that he would have to return is the Tovas Hana'ah, which is what? Let's say that you were in a particular business. You're a Malamed, you are a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're a businessman, you're whatever, a financial advisor, and you normally would pay a certain amount of money to a broker in order to bring you business. So whatever amount was saved, he says it's either 1% or 2%, of the total amount that would typically be given to the broker, whatever the fee would be, that's the amount that would have to be disgorged. But he says the rest, it's not as if after this transaction has taken place and the Malamed has learned with the children of the Love, that the Love would have the right to say at that point in time, hey, Ribbis, I'm not paying you anything. He has to pay for the services that were rendered. He goes and he fixes the kitchen sink. He still has the Love still has to pay for the services that were rendered, but you can just subtract from that amount whatever would have been the skara sarsur, whatever would be an amount that would be typically paid to a broker in the middle. Rabbi Reisman points out that this really only, that this whole formula and the requirement to pay anything would only set in if you held, and this appears to be mukhrach from the lashon of the Maharsham, if you hold that Tovas Hana'ah is mammon. If you hold the Tovas Hana'ah is ein mammon, so then really, if you can stop the transaction from occurring in the first place, from the teaching arrangement from taking place, you stop it. But once it's already taken place, so then the money would have to be paid at that point in time, and there wouldn't be any deduction made if l'maaseh the service was actually provided, and then the amount would have to be paid. So now I just want to spend a few minutes on what I call the sister case, which has always been a case that intrigued me a lot, which is the loan-for-loan transaction. That we say that if it is sort of a service-for-service transaction, somebody just came over to me this morning, after davening. Somebody came over to me. They asked me a question. They said that they needed a ride to the airport, and that it was very hard to get. It was like very early in the morning or whatever. And they said, listen, if you give me a ride to LaGuardia at 4 in the morning, I'll drive you, a couple of days. I know you have to go to the airport, and I'll drive you to Newark. So he said, would that be usher? Is that a problem of Ribbis? It didn't occur to him. So I said, yeah, Pipashas, that's a problem of Ribbis, because you're making a condition. If you would say, I'll take you to LaGuardia, and when the time comes, you'll also take me to LaGuardia. So he said, that would be okay. That would be okay if the seasons and the times were roughly equal in terms of, the tircha and the amount of time and so forth. But here, they're clearly going to Newark is a much more arduous and lengthy journey than driving to LaGuardia. So I said that taco would be problematic. He said, so what should I do? He said, I really needed it, and he already took me. So, but now I need to return favor. So what can I do? I said, you have to pater him. You have to pater him. You have to tell him that he's exempt, that he doesn't have to take you to Newark. So he said, but what am I? But now I'm going to be stuck. I really that was the whole point, So I said, you're stuck. You're stuck. I said, if you have a friendly relationship that you always do nice things for each other anyway, and out of the generosity of his heart, he decides that he wants to take you. So maybe there's what to discuss. But first, you have to let him off the hook and make it clear that he's not obligated to do it. So he found that so intriguing. So he said he didn't. It would not have occurred to him. That there's such a halacha. But they're okay. But if it's a tit for tat, service for service transaction, so then generally speaking, it's going to be permissible. I'll plow your field today, you'll plow my field tomorrow. Generally speaking, we're going to say that's okay. So why is it not okay to say, I'm going to loan you today and you're going to loan me tomorrow? So according to some poskim, the Sefer Trumas, there's other the opinion that it is okay. It is okay. And basically based on the same argument that we find with respect to the case of the field that the malva is allowed to keep under his possession, based on a tanai that if the lover wants to sell it, he'll sell it to the malva for the amount of the original loan. Because as the Radbaz says, there's no neshek and there's no tapis. So says the Sefer Trumas, the same idea with respect to this transaction. He says that when a new loan is being extended, Malva's not getting anything. He's going to have to return that loan money. So therefore, there's no neshek and there's no tapis, and therefore it should be perfectly fine. The Mordechai thought that this is mamish ribbis kitzutza. And why would it be ribbis kitzutza? Because you're mamish getting something extra. Because unlike the transaction where one person's providing a service and then the payment, so to speak, is that the other person provides a service, here the payment of the original loan that the malva provided to the lover was that the lover paid back the loan. And it was finished. But the malva is saying, pay back the loan, plus I want you to do something else. What's the something else I want you to do? I want you to extend me a loan. So that's something else. But that something else doesn't have neshek, doesn't have tabis. So the Avnei Nezer points out that there are really three different opinions as to what as to how we view this transaction. Look in source Chafei. He says either it's ribbis kitzutz like the Mordechai said, or it's mut like the Sefer Truma says. But really, probably the best explanation, and this is the one that's adopted by the Gra, by the Vilna Gaon, if you look in source Chavav, is that it's essentially like ribbis dvarim. That it's a form of ribbis devarim, that just like you can't have, even though there may not be no value, there may not be any value to that nobody would pay any money for the lover to say shalom aleichem to me in the street, but it's something extra that he's doing before that he wouldn't have had to have done otherwise. So too, the lover is going to extend a loan to me. He wouldn't have extended this loan to me otherwise, if not for the fact that I'm extending this loan to him today. It's something in addition to the repayment of the loan that he is doing. So therefore, it's going to be just as bad as ribbis devarim. But the Bir Agra ends with the following lashon. And they look in source Chavav. He says that the b'chol zeh shelo haya oselo b'lav hachi. He says that Vayei Mordechai Shama Svar Rishona Iker. The Svar Rishona, he says, is the Iker that it's going to be prohibited. And why is it going to be prohibited? So the Gra says that Afilu Dibor Aser, because after all, even Ribbis Dvarim is Aser. Because zeh Shelo haya oselo b'lav hachi. But it's only if the borrower wouldn't have lended him otherwise. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Because the lender, loans some money to the borrower, so does that mean that the borrower is going to be permanently prohibited from ever extending a loan to the lender? No, it can't be. It's only going to be a problem of ribbis dvarim. But this idea of what he says that it's only going to be a problem if he wouldn't have done it otherwise, it sounds a little bit like from the Bir Agra. You could tell me, your own interpretation of this. It sounds a little bit in the Bir Agra because since we're talking about an actual stipulation case, we're talking about an actual stipulation case, and the way that this and the Ramah himself quotes that yesh omim that it's aser and yesh omim that it's that it's mutter. So it's not like the Ramah himself is bringing multiple opinions over here, even though we're going to follow the opinion that yesh omim to aser. But the Gra seems to be saying that we're going to be makel even in a case of stipulation. If the borrower had a type of relationship with the lender or with the world, that he would have extended the loan otherwise, so then we're going to consider this stipulation to be lo ma'alev lo morid. It's interesting, does anybody actually say that? So the Torah's Ribbis jumps to the occasion again and says, hey, I'm the one going out on a limb in these cases, I'll go on a limb over here. The Torah's Ribbis actually says that even if there's a stipulation, that the way we would pass halacha l'maaseh, the lender stipulates to the borrower, I'm going to loan you today and you're going to loan me a month from now. If it's rogil, that they had the type of relationship where they're extending loans for each other regularly, even if it's actually stipulated, it's going to be mutter. This is more sweeping than the case of kol malacha shetava liyado, where we don't find anybody who really says this, but that's what the Vilna Gaon says. Now, if there is no stipulation, so then if I say that the only problem over here is basically a problem of a ribbis devarim, so then it should follow that once a loan is repaid, if the borrower, out of his own generosity and good heart, thinks to himself, okay, well, the lender paid me money, loaned me money, and now I'm going to, do the same thing for the lender, but it wasn't stipulated that he had to do it. There's more room to be makel in this case based on the ribbis dvarim consideration. In fact, that's how the Darkei Tshuva paskins. You look in the Darkei Tshuva source Chavtes, he quotes from the Sefer Chedrei De'ah, he says, Pashut, Tahainu Dafka B'Ketzitza L'Chatchila B'Feirush, Aval B'Stam, but if I have a Stam situation, Nire Pashut, to lo hava isura, then it's pashut to me. He says that there would be no isur in this case if there was no stipulation, and the borrower afterwards decides that he wants to extend the loan to the lender. So then that should be perfectly permissible, and that would seem to be consistent as well with the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch Harav, who says the Shel Sofim Holech Achara Mekom Amachmet Tova LaBracha, that if I'm only dealing with a D'Rabbanan concern, and obviously when there's no Ketzitza, it's only a D'Rabbanan concern, so then he says that there is room to be Mekel in the Halva case, so I think that's also consistent with what we said. How much would have to be repaid in the amount that there, if I'm going to assume, like the Mordechai, that this is actual Ribbis Ketzutza, so how much would have to be repaid in this particular case? So it's a very intriguing Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says that, well, we're dealing over here with a sort of what's the value when the borrower is going to extend a loan in return to the lender, so he's just losing his money for that period of time. But we don't generally view that as having any kind of intrinsic value per se in terms of collectability, mevato kiso, type of cost. So he says it's only the amount of actual profit that the lender was able to receive from the funds that he got from the borrower afterwards if he invested in and profited it. So it's that profit amount that would have to be disgorged. Why is that not considered to be ribbis, the amount that's being given from the borrower to the lender in terms of the second loan? So he says because it's not really being given b'toras loan. It's being given as a b'toras, a repayment or a condition of the original loan. So he says it was, and therefore, it wasn't the borrower's intention to loan him money. The original loan itself was just ribbis, that he had to make this additional loan as ribbis, and therefore it's not considered to have a status of halva altogether, according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. I find that to be a tremendous chiddush, but l'maisa that's what he says. You could also say that even if I would characterize the second payment as a real loan, when the malva is giving back whatever profit he made at that point in time, he's not giving that amount back as ribbis, but he's giving that amount back as a way out of the problem that he had created, a ribbis situation. And whenever money is being given, not b'toras ribbis, but for some other reason, legitimate reason, so you can say that therefore that would obviate the ribbis problem. But Rabbi Akiva Eiger himself has this different formulation. I found it intriguing. The Chelkas Binyamin quoted Rabbi Akiva Eiger as just saying that he pays back the time value of money, but if you look at the actual lashon of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he clearly says that it's only in the event that there was revach that was made by the malveh from the money at the time that it was loaned. The last thing that the poskim talk about is a long bris Yehuda on this in Sif Lamed Beis is with respect to these types of organizations. They was kind of gemach organizations or credit union type organizations, you can argue, where people would contribute money into the organization. So, and lots of people would contribute, and part of what you would get the right to do as a result of contributing money is that you would be allowed to borrow money from this organization, and whenever you wanted to leave the organization, then you would be allowed to take your money out. So why isn't this considered to be hey, I'm going to loan to you and you loan to me? So maybe this should be problematic. And the Bris Yehuda quotes a Maram Shik about this. And he says that the Maram Shik says that as long as whatever is being loaned is without ribbis, he thinks that it's not problematic because there is no specific, it's not behechrech that every single person who puts the money in is necessarily going to have a need to take out a loan in the end. It could be that certain people will only be borrowers, and then when the time comes that they're going to need a loan, there won't be funds available necessarily to give them a loan. And it's not necessarily the case in either direction, that if you take a loan that you're going to then be giving a loan, or that if you give a loan, you're going to eventually be taking a loan. And therefore, his conclusion is that these organizations are okay. You look in the Torah's Ribbis, who has a much more terse explanation, says time that we don't worry about these things. So let's say there's no money left because everybody else rushed to take loans before this other person who had contributed money had contributed his money. So he's only entitled to take a loan if there's money available in the coffers. There's no additional obligation other than the initial contribution for the others to obtain additional money. So it's clear that the mere fact that I'm loaning to you does not give you, the recipient of the funds, the obligation to then go back and to loan more money to me if there is no money available in the coffers. So therefore, the tendency of the poskim is to be make on this case. And one of the other reasons may be because it was arguable as to whether this really was problematic to begin with. As we said, we have all of these different shitos when given the fact that there really was no neshek and no tabis, and essentially it's probably more like the Vilna Gaon says that we're dealing with something that probably is no more serious than a Ribbis devarim type of situation. So the bottom line is that we don't allow either of these arrangements. Not the arrangement that a malveh can loan money to the loveh in order for the loveh, with the condition that the loveh is going to give his work and his business to the malveh, even though there's going to be a fair market paid for whatever business is going to be performed. And even if it's the malveh saying, I want you to patronize my store, that as a general rule, we do not allow it, particularly if it's going to be explicit. And so too, in the case of a malveh who loans money to a borrower on condition for the borrower to then extend the loan to the lender, if it's something that they always did anyway, so there's a possible heter that the Torah's Ribbis reads into the Vilna Gaon, but in general, we're not going to assume it would have been done anyway, because who knows what they really would have done anyway. But otherwise, assuming that there is no actual stipulation, there is much more wiggle room in these types of cases. Number one, we're generally not dealing with a situation that's more than Ribbis d'Rabbanan. Certainly, in the latter case, the Gra understands that it's Ribbis Dvarim. In the first case, we generally of the Malacha, we generally assume Tovas Hana'ah ain't a mammon, and therefore there's more room to be makel when you have a rugil type of situation where the person had patronized the business, the loveh had patronized the business of the malveh beforehand, for example, or they already had this type of relationship beforehand. There's more room to be makel when the initiative for the transaction is coming from the loveh. There's more room to be makel, certainly in the business transaction when there was no stipulation altogether, and particularly when the malveh started out with money in his possession, and he is simply going to stipulate that he's going to pay money for the loveh to do something for him, or he's going to buy a chayfetz from the loveh. Whenever it's not clearly going to be a tit-for-tat situation, but there's going to be a clear-cut obligation, like in the cases of these credit unions and the like, there's also room to be makel. And obviously, since we're dealing with Ribbis d'Rabbanan, when we're dealing with the gemachs and stucco organizations, also more leeway when it comes to these situations. And that's the basic summary of this topic. Thank you very much. Okay. See you. Yeah. For what?
Something I have that I just wanted to confirm that Rebbe said for 5 years ago.
If I remember.
Yeah, or it was about waterfall distribution, it's a real estate, but whatever. There's a million conditions in it.
I don't remember talking about it 5 years ago.
No, not talking about it.
Yeah, okay,
in emails that you answered questions to in Harmon and Ariel Schreier.
Oh, that could be.
Yeah, so that actual in terms of
I had three problems. I had three problems with it, from what I recall. One is that there's an obligation even when the event that there is no actual profit. I think that was one of the problems.
I saw in the email from it. That was that. Good.
Yeah. And I remember there were two other problems. I don't remember what the two other problems were.
Language distinction, whether it was accrued or cumulative. Okay, that was. But
Yeah.
within that was that first problem.
Right.
I didn't see
That's the problem. That's the problem that I most readily remember. I don't remember the other ones.
If there's capital calls, then I'll
Yeah.
tonight there's interest, of course. But Rebbe was being medai, but it seems is from my email. But is Rebbe not worried if they're code save a certain amount when there is Reva? When we're going to make Reva, we're going to give you that amount. You'll be so to speak the preferred return. You'll get the first amount.
The first problem that I identified would not exist. If it's only right. I don't remember the other part. I have to remind myself what the other problem was. That's the only problem that I remember off the top of my head. Yeah. That was probably the most obvious one. Yeah.
There's different cheetahs. When it's Chatzav, then there's no star. Doesn't quote any Mekilim. And there's no Rebbe, and we're practicing. Right. But when there is Rebbe, we're still giving you quoted.
Then it seems to me that there might be more room to be made. Yeah. I brought all the problems, but I was mostly concerned about the first problem. That's my recollection.
That's the